Like the cardiovascular system, the function of the respiratory system remained a mystery until just a few hundred years ago. This is no doubt partly due to the fact that oxygen itself wasn't discovered until around the American Revolution. The respiratory system works alongside its cousin organ system, the cardiovascular system, to help bring oxygen to the trillions of cells in our body and carry carbon dioxide away. We cannot live long without oxygen. Our brains begin suffering irreversible damage after about 3 minutes of oxygen deprivation. In this chapter, we discuss how this system helps deliver the life-sustaining gas to our tissues. Welcome to the voiceover lecture for Chapter 13, the Respiratory System. I've divided Chapter 13 into 5 sections. In Section 1, we'll talk about an overview of the respiratory system. In Section 2, we'll focus on the anatomy of the upper respiratory system. In Section 3, we'll discuss the anatomy of the lower respiratory system. In Section 4, we'll talk about the physiology of respiration. And in Section 5, problems that arise with the respiratory system. Section 1, an overview of the respiratory system. First, let's discuss the functions of the respiratory system. Our body cells need a continuous supply of oxygen in order to make ATP. Recall that ATP is the energy currency of the cell and is absolutely vital for powering the life-sustaining processes within our cells. Do you remember which organelle is responsible for making ATP? In the process of making ATP, carbon dioxide is produced as a waste. Low oxygen results in oxygen starvation, and ATP production halts. Too much carbon dioxide can lead to toxic acid buildup in our tissues. So it's vital that we maintain the proper balance between these two gases. So this brings us to the main role of the respiratory system, to exchange these gases with the atmosphere. Other functions of the respiratory system include regulating blood pH. Accessory structures of the respiratory system include receptors for smell, can help filter air, helps produce the sounds we use when we communicate verbally, helps rid our body of water and heat, and as we breathe, our respiratory system can help pump lymph fluids within the lymphatic vessels. Now let's discuss the components of the respiratory system. The organs of our respiratory system include our nose, our pharynx or throat, our larynx or voice box, our trachea, our windpipe, our bronchi, and our lungs. The various organs of the respiratory system can be divided in 2 different ways, either by their structure or function. Let's begin with the structural classifications of the respiratory organs. We can divide the organs of the respiratory system into 2 categories based on their structure. First is the upper respiratory system, which is located superior to the lower respiratory system, and this includes our nose, nasal cavity, and pharynx. The second half is the lower respiratory system and includes the larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. Note that some texts and some sources will categorize the larynx as part of the upper respiratory system. For my course, we'll include the larynx as part of the lower respiratory system. The second way of categorizing the organs of the respiratory system is based on their function. The first group of organs is included in a category called the conducting zone. So this is a series of interconnected tubes and cavities that are responsible for bringing air to the lungs, which includes the organs such as the nose, nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and bronchioles. Compare this to the respiratory zone. This is where gas exchange actually occurs, and includes tubes and tissues within the lungs, particularly the bronchioles, alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, and alveoli. This diagram shows the structural divisions of the respiratory system and some of the organs in each of those divisions. Beginning here with the upper respiratory tract, you can see the nose, nasal cavity, and pharynx. In the lower respiratory tract is the larynx, trachea, bronchioles, and lungs. Section 2. The anatomy of the upper respiratory tract. Let's begin with the nose. Our nose is divided into several parts. Our external nose is the portion that's visible on our face. It's supported by the bone of our skull and hyaline cartilage. The nares are the nostrils or openings to our nose. Moving on to our internal nose or nasal cavity. Within the nasal cavity is the nasal septum, which divides the internal nose into left and right halves along the midline. Just within the nostrils or nares is the nasal vestibule, which is lined with skin and hair. Deeper in the nasal cavity are the nasal conchae. These help subdivide the nasal cavity into groove-like passageways. This helps to increase the surface area, which prevents dehydration by trapping moisture and water droplets during exhalation. The term conchae refers to the appearance or similarity of these structures to the shell of a snail. Our nasal cavity is lined with a type of epithelium called the respiratory mucosa. In fact, this lines most of the respiratory tract. The respiratory mucosa contains many thin-walled veins that help warm incoming air. The respiratory mucosa also produces mucus. This mucus is sticky and helps trap pathogens and debris and helps moisten the incoming air. Also within the nasal cavity is the palate. This helps separate the oral and nasal cavities. The hard palate is the anterior portion and is supported by the bone of our skull. The soft palate is the posterior portion that's unsupported by bone and is hence soft. The soft palate is muscular. This picture is showing a frontal section through the skull, revealing the nasal conchae within the skull. You can see these scroll-like or snail shell-like protuberances. Those are the nasal conchae. Next is the paranasal sinuses. These are a ring of smaller cavities around the nasal cavity. In fact, they're actually holes within the skull, and they help lighten the skull. They also provide a resonance chamber for speech. When we're healthy, paranasal sinuses are filled with air. One of the functions of these sinuses is to produce mucus. Paranasal sinuses are all interconnected with each other with tiny holes, and they're also connected to the nasal cavity. Next we have the pharynx. The pharynx is also known as the throat. It's a funnel-shaped tube that provides a passageway for air and food. The pharynx is divided into 3 regions. The superior nasopharynx, so named because of its proximity to the nasal cavity. The oropharynx in the middle, named because of its proximity to the oral cavity. And the laryngopharynx, the most inferior portion, is closest to the larynx. Here you can see the pharynx divided into its 3 regions. The superior nasopharynx, closest to the nasal cavity, the oropharynx closest to the oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx closest to the larynx. This diagram shows various details of the upper respiratory tract through a parasagittal section of the left side of the head and neck. In section 3, we will discuss the anatomy of the lower respiratory tract. Let's begin with the anatomy of the larynx. The larynx is also known as the voice box. It's a short passage between the laryngopharynx and the trachea. It's anterior to the esophagus and is composed of 9 pieces of cartilage. I only require you to know 2 of the 9 pieces. First, you should know the epiglottis. The epiglottis covers the glottis when we swallow. It helps direct food to the esophagus, so we don't get food in our trachea. If you go to the course YouTube channel, you'll see a video x-ray of a person eating and drinking. If you look carefully, you can see the epiglottis in action as the person swallows. The second piece of laryngeal cartilage that you should know is called the thyroid cartilage, nicknamed the Adam's apple. It's composed of two fused plates of cartilage and is located at the anterior wall of the larynx. The thyroid cartilage is larger in males and may serve to help deepen the voice. You can feel and see the thyroid cartilage when you swallow. This diagram shows two different views of the thyroid cartilage. Here's an anterior view on the left and a posterior view on the right. You can see the thyroid cartilage is located close to the thyroid gland, hence its name. You don't need to know all these various structures of the thyroid cartilage. Within the larynx are two pairs of folds. First we have the vestibular folds, or false vocal cords. The false vocal cords don't produce sound, but they help us hold our breath when our lungs are under pressure. The opening between the folds is called the rima vestibuli. Next are the vocal folds, or true vocal cords. These are the principal structures in voice production. The laryngeal ventricle is the space between the vestibular and vocal folds. The vocal folds contain vocal ligaments. Collectively, the vestibular folds and the vocal folds are known as the glottis. Here's a frontal section allowing us to view the larynx. Here you can see the first set of folds, the vestibular folds, on the left and right. The space in between the two folds is the rima vestibuli. Inferior to those are the vocal folds on the left and right, and the space in between those two pairs of folds is the laryngeal ventricle. You can see below the larynx is the trachea. To the left and right of the larynx, you can see they've captured some of the thyroid cartilage, and up above you can see a bit of the epiglottal cartilage. Now let's briefly discuss voice production. Sound is produced when we exhale, and the moving air causes our true vocal cords to rapidly vibrate. Like a musical instrument, we can change the pitch of our voice. We can change how fast or slow the vocal cords vibrate. That changes the pitch. We can increase the pitch by the adduction of the vocal cords. Adduction means to move a body part closer to the midline. We can lower the pitch of our voice by abduction, or moving the vocal cords away from the midline. To help remember this, think about how the vocal cords moving toward the midline are getting closer to each other or being added together. Adduction. We can also control the volume of our voice by changing the force at which we force air out of our lungs. There are other components of speech that are controlled by many other organs. Our pharynx, mouth, nasal cavity, and paranasal sinuses act as resonating chambers to help amplify and enhance the timbre of our voice. Last, our face muscles, tongue, and lips allow us to enunciate and articulate words. These diagrams show the larynx from a superior view, or how you would see them with a laryngoscope. On the left, the epithelial tissues have been removed to view the cartilage and ligaments. Let's focus on the right two diagrams. The upper diagram shows the vocal cords being abducted or moved away from the midline, producing a lower pitch. The lower diagram shows the vocal cords being adducted, helping to produce a higher pitch. This GIF shows the vocal cords from a superior view using a laryngoscope. These are real human vocal cords. If you look closely, you can see the vocal cords vibrate. That vibration is what helps produce our voice. Next we have the trachea, or windpipe. The trachea is the tube that's anterior to the esophagus. Along its length are many C-shaped cartilage rings, giving the trachea its classic ridged appearance. These cartilage rings help stop the trachea from collapsing. The epithelia of the trachea is lined with ciliated mucosa. The mucus produced by the mucosa helps trap pathogens and debris. The cilia beat and produce a current that helps push the mucus in the superior direction, up the trachea. That mucus goes up and down into the esophagus where we swallow and digest and break down those pathogens. The acidic environment of our stomach does not allow respiratory pathogens to survive. Here's a cross-section of the trachea showing you that it's composed of several layers. You do not need to know the layers of the trachea for this test. The trachea divides into two. These are called the bronchi. The right main bronchus is shorter and straighter, and objects are more likely to lodge here, and brings air to the right lung. The left main bronchus brings air to the left lung. The carina is the ridge of cartilage at the base of the trachea, where the bronchi first divide. The carina has a sensitive membrane that helps trigger the cough reflex. Next is the lungs. The narrow top portion of the lungs are the apexes, and the broad bottom parts of the lungs are the bases. We of course have two lungs, a right lung and a left lung. The right lung has 3 lobes, and the left lung only has 2 lobes. Also, the left lung has this notch where the heart is located. The lungs are surrounded by 2 layers known as pleurae. These are the serous membranes. The visceral pleura is the layer that covers each lung. The parietal pleura lines the thoracic cavity walls. The space in between is the pleural cavity. It's filled with a lubricating fluid. These 2 layers and the fluid in between help reduce friction while you're breathing. Pleurisy is the inflammation of the pleura. This diagram shows some of the structures we've already discussed. Here you can see the larynx containing the thyroid cartilage. You can see the trachea with its cartilaginous rings. At the base here is the carina, the dividing point between the right and left bronchi. The tubes of the respiratory tract continue to branch and get smaller and smaller. After the bronchi are the bronchioles. These are even smaller tubes. They lack the cartilaginous rings of the bronchi and trachea, and they are surrounded by smooth muscle that allows us to open and close these passageways. The bronchioles end in structures called alveoli, discussed on the following slide. Our lungs are filled with alveoli. Alveoli occur in grape-like clusters known as alveolar sacs. Each alveoli is its own little air-filled sac. It's at the level of the alveoli where gas exchange between our lungs and our blood occurs. This diagram shows another view of alveoli and alveolar sacs. At the smallest level within our lungs is the respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane includes the walls of the alveoli, which are made up of simple squamous epithelial tissue that's thinner than tissue paper. Also contained within this membrane is a web of capillaries. The alveoli, the capillary walls, and some elastic fibers make up the respiratory membrane. On one side of the respiratory membrane is air in the lungs, and on the other is blood within the capillaries. Oxygen is going to pass from the alveoli into the blood, and CO2 will come from the blood and go into the air within the alveoli. This diagram shows the various components of the respiratory membrane. On the left, you can see the alveoli filled with air. you can see the alveolar membrane, or alveolar wall. You can see the capillaries and the capillary walls with the blood inside. And over on the right, you can see gas exchange. Oxygen leaves the alveoli and enters the blood, and CO2 leaves the blood and enters the alveoli. There are other structures in this diagram that you do not need to know. And that's the end of part 1 of the voiceover lecture for chapter 13 on the respiratory system. Stay tuned for part 2.